I stood in front of the mirror, the clown's gaze meeting mine. It was no longer merely my reflection. It had become something more, something distorted, something profoundly unsettling. My face drained of color, my eyes hollow beneath the fixed, grotesque grin. I tried, almost desperately, to claw away at my own skin, but it remained obstinately fixed. I had allowed him in, and now he had become me. It began on an uneventful day, one of those devoid of any notable excitement. I sat at my computer, absent-mindedly scrolling through Marketplace, aimless in my boredom. And that's when I saw it. A vintage clown figurine. There was an eerie charm about it, the kind that compels you without reason. It was inexpensive, marketed as rare, and I clicked buy now without a second thought. That marked the beginning of my mistakes. A week later, the package arrived. I distinctly remember my initial reaction. This is far too large for a figurine. I tore it open only to discover not a quaint statuette but a full-sized clown costume. A nightmarish ensemble reminiscent of those seen in grainy, late-night documentaries about unsolved crimes. It exuded a stale, dusty odor mixed with something sour, almost putrid. Initially, I believed it to be some sort of prank. I attempted to contact the seller, but the profile had vanished without a trace. I discarded the costume in the basement, intending to deal with it later. Perhaps I'd sell it to some eccentric collector. But that night, things began to shift. The doorbell rang at precisely 3 a.m. I stumbled out of bed, still groggy, and answered the door. There was nothing, just darkness and wind. I attributed it to pranksters and returned inside, only to notice the basement light flickering erratically. I went down to investigate, but everything appeared normal, except for the pervasive sense that I was being watched. Over the next few days, it escalated. Shadows loomed just at the periphery of my vision, always present, yet intangible. Sleep eluded me. Every minute noise set my nerves on edge. Then, late one night, I heard unmistakable footsteps emanating from the basement. Fear surged through me, and my breath caught in my throat. Grabbing a flashlight, I tried to rationalize it as a figment of my imagination. But when I reached the basement, the costume, it wasn't where I had left it. It stood there, upright, as though watching me. Panic surged. I fled upstairs, almost stumbling, and locked myself in the bathroom. My heart raced, my ears ringing with each pulse. Was I losing my mind? I remained locked inside for hours before finally climbing out the bathroom window and calling the police. They found nothing. The costume they claimed was neatly folded in the basement, untouched. And then came the message. A Facebook notification from the seller. The words froze me. "You can't escape. You've invited him into your home." I shattered my phone in a futile act of defiance, but it changed nothing. The message lingered in my thoughts. Who had I invited? The clown? The entity within that grotesque costume? Sleep became impossible. Each creak of the house, each rustle of the wind, had me on edge, my anxiety spiraling. And again, around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, deliberate, ascending the stairs. I armed myself with a kitchen knife and approached. The living room lay in darkness, but when I flicked on the light, there it was. The clown costume suspended from the ceiling like some macabre effigy. Instinctively, I lunged, stabbing repeatedly. But it was hollow. Empty fabric, lifeless, swayed in the artificial light. I thought it had ended. But the following morning, the costume had disappeared. I wanted to believe it was over, that it was all an elaborate trick of my mind. But later that day, I glimpsed my reflection. My complexion, ghostly, my eyes sunken as if deprived of rest for days. I resembled a clown. My friends commented on my appearance, expressing concern, but they couldn't see what I did. And then once more, the doorbell. I didn't dare answer. I knew who it was. The clown, or whatever dwelled within that sinister costume. Footsteps resounded outside, slow, deliberate. I remained frozen, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, I looked outside. The costume now hung from a tree in my front yard. A note pinned to it read, "It's only a matter of time." I disposed of it, drove miles away, tossed it in a dumpster, and hoped. But that night, the basement door creaked ominously. The foul stench of rot wafted through the house, and by morning, the costume lay neatly folded on my bed. Wherever I went, it followed. Reflections, shadows. It was omnipresent. My friends thought I was descending into paranoia. In desperation, I spent the night at a friend's house, hoping distance would sever the link. At 3 a.m., his doorbell rang. We found the costume in his hallway. That's when I understood. It wasn't the house that was cursed, it was me. Determined to find answers, I dug into records, uncovering details about the costume's original owner. He had been found dead, enveloped in the costume, accompanied by a note, "You can't escape." One fateful night, I woke to find myself encased in it. The material clung tightly as though it had fused with my skin. In the mirror, I no longer recognized myself. I saw him. The painted grin, those hollow eyes. Frantic, I tore at the fabric, but it would not yield. It had become a part of me. In that moment, I knew the truth. I had allowed him in, and now there would be no release. Story 2. He lay prostrate, gasping, yet there remained an unmistakable persistence of madness in his gaze. Blood streaked across his lips as the cacophony of approaching sirens intensified. The children had been evacuated, but I was still uncertain whether genuine safety had been secured. Not yet. I held the bat aloft, my hands trembling, prepared for any further provocation. One more move, and I would swing again, I assured myself. Just one more. Earlier that day, the party was already in full swing, and exhaustion had settled into my bones. Children ran around, their high-pitched screams piercing the air, which was typical for a Saturday engagement. It was a backyard birthday celebration. Bounce house, shrieking children, and hot dogs charred by distracted parents. Then Bingo made his entrance. Big red shoes, a garish outfit, and a painted-on grin that never quite seemed sincere. It was the kind of smile that evoked distrust, but the children adored him. I felt ready to call it a day before it even began. Bingo began with balloon animals, twisting them into recognizable shapes that elicited squeals of delight. He fashioned a dog, a giraffe, something vaguely resembling a dinosaur, and the children were enraptured. Yet, his eyes were unsettling. They remained static even while the rest of his face animated, smiling, joking, making exaggerated expressions. I tried to dismiss it, attributing my discomfort to sheer exhaustion. I had been handling back-to-back events all weekend. Maybe my tired mind was simply conjuring paranoia. Jenna, my colleague, leaned in. "What's going on with you today?" she asked, nudging my shoulder. "Don't you think he's a bit off?" I whispered, nodding toward Bingo, who was now juggling scarves, his performance sending the kids into fits of laughter. Jenna merely laughed. "He's a clown, Maria. They're all a little creepy." "Relax." I attempted to laugh along, but it fell flat. Something about him made my skin crawl. Perhaps it was nothing, I told myself. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The children continued their chaotic play, laughing and chasing each other while Bingo executed his tricks, pulling endless scarves from his sleeve, pretending to stumble over his oversized shoes, the usual repertoire. Yet every time his gaze met mine, an instinctive unease gripped me. It was as if he were in on a dark joke, one from which I was excluded. Then I saw it. Bingo was crouched low, talking quietly to a little girl with pigtails. His hand lingered on her shoulder for an unnaturally long moment, his grin widening, his eyes locked onto her with a disturbing intensity. My stomach twisted, and I pulled Jenna aside again, my voice urgent. "He's not right, Jenna. Something is seriously wrong with this guy." Jenna sighed, rolling her eyes. "Maria, chill. You're overthinking this. Maybe lay off the horror movies for a bit, yeah?" She laughed again, and I despised how easily she dismissed my concerns. Still, I stayed quiet. Perhaps she was right. Yet the unease lingered. I couldn't let it go. I took out my phone and searched for Clown Fun Time. the agency we'd hired Bingo through. The reviews were uniformly 5 stars, but something about them felt artificial. They were too perfect, almost identical in phrasing. Anxiety settled into my chest, tightening. I attempted to call the agency, but my call went straight to voicemail. Then I noticed something else. The reviews had stopped suddenly a few weeks prior. Odd. Before I could dwell on it, another commotion erupted. One of the children spilled juice over the cake table. Amid the chaos, I saw Bingo request to use the bathroom. I watched him walk toward the house, his hunched posture rendering his appearance even more sinister. I tried to refocus on entertaining the kids, but that gnawing sense of dread wouldn't dissipate. Then I heard it, a muffled crying sound. Initially, I assumed it was just a child having a tantrum. But the sound wasn't coming from the yard. It was emanating from inside the house. My heart sank as I followed the sound down the hallway. And that's when I saw it. Bingo, crouched in a darkened corner, whispering something to one of the young boys, his hand clamped tightly around the child's wrist, attempting to drag him toward a closet. My blood ran cold, and before I even realized it, I shouted, "Hey!" Bingo spun around, his eyes wide with surprise. Without hesitation, I rushed forward, grabbed the boy, and pushed him back toward the hallway. "Go back to the party," I urged, struggling to keep my voice steady, even as my heart pounded furiously. Bingo straightened slowly, looming over me. His smile vanished. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain composed. He remained silent, advancing a step closer, his breath carrying a rancid stench. Panic surged through me, and I turned, bolting for the door. He was quicker than I anticipated. His hand clamped around my arm, his grip iron-like. I fought back, kicking at him frantically. My hand shot up, yanking off his mask, and what I saw beneath it made me scream. His face was scarred, twisted, his lips smeared with something dark. Blood. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind me. He wasn't a clown. He was something much more sinister. My thoughts raced to recent news reports. An escaped convict, missing for days. This had to be him. He lunged at me, and I narrowly dodged, scrambling down the hallway. My legs felt weak, barely supporting me, but I forced myself to move. I had to reach the children. I burst into the backyard, breathless. "Get out, now!" The children stared at me, confused, but Jenna caught the look in my eyes and began ushering them toward the gate. Bingo was right behind me, but I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a folding chair and swung it at him, striking his arm. He grunted in pain but kept advancing. Jenna screamed, herding the children out as parents began arriving amidst the chaos. I spotted a baseball bat lying in the grass, one of the kids' toys. I seized it, swung hard, and struck Bingo on the head. He went down, but only momentarily. He rose again, staggering towards me, his eyes filled with a wild rage. The wail of sirens was close now. Someone had called the police, but I wasn't sure they would arrive in time. Bingo lunged again, but this time, I was ready. I swung the bat once more, hitting him in the side. He collapsed to the ground, gasping. The police arrived just as I stood over him, trembling, the bat still in my hands. They pulled me away, cuffing Bingo before he could stand again. I collapsed onto the grass, chest heaving, my mind racing with disbelief. They found a knife hidden in his costume. Later, I learned that the real Bingo had been discovered, bound in a storage unit miles away. The imposter had been targeting children's parties for weeks, using falsified reviews to conceal his activities. They called me a hero, but I couldn't bring myself to feel like one. I had let him in. I had ignored my instincts, and children had nearly suffered as a result. For days, sleep eluded me. The vision of his scarred face, those deranged eyes, haunted my every thought. The guilt was inescapable. How had I overlooked the signs? How had it come so close? The story dominated the news for days. Parents were horrified. Parties were canceled, and the agency shut down. None of it provided any solace. Jenna tried to console me, but the memory of how close we had come to catastrophe was inescapable. I replayed the events repeatedly, each ignored warning glaring in hindsight. It haunted me. I continue to plan events, but clowns are no longer an option. Not after that, and no matter how much time passes, I will never forget those eyes, fixed on me, and the visceral realization that we had narrowly evaded something far worse than I could have imagined.